The command to love your neighbor, much like loving your brother, if we try to live that out with a community of people who all agree that we ought to be doing that, it's going to naturally lead to somebody at some point asking the question, okay, well, who is my neighbor, really? Not all that different from somebody asking the question, oh, come on, who's really my brother? And that was a question that Jesus got asked. Jesus answered this question with the parable of the Good Samaritan. A lot of the time, I hear the parable of the Good Samaritan described as a parable that's supposed to demonstrate that everybody's your neighbor. But I've never seen anything in the parable that would actually indicate that everybody's your neighbor, and that's the point of the parable. It seems to me that Jesus kind of lays out the punchline for the parable by asking, who was neighbor to the man who fell among the thieves? And the correct answer that was given was the one who showed mercy. So it would kind of seem to be, the point would seem to be not that everybody's your neighbor and that's the point, but rather that the person who you despise may be more of a neighbor to you than you are to him, as demonstrated by his actions, which then exposes your duplicity in asking the question that you want to withhold affinity and support from the very kind of person who is near enough and human enough that he could end up giving to you what you withhold from him, thus shaming you and exposing your false piety. Jesus didn't, for example, he didn't use the parable explicitly to try to show that, let's say, an abusive Roman soldier or an invading barbarian should be thought of as your neighbor. Now, that concept he dealt with separately by teaching that we should love our enemies as well as our neighbors, which is a separate concept, even though both of them are kind of an answer to the same kind of nitpicking, possibly hypocritical question, the question of who's my neighbor? I don't want to love my neighbor. This person's not my neighbor, and those are kind of two different ways to answer the same question. We could think of the command to love your enemy as being a different aspect to the answer basically of how far should I be expected for my love for neighbor to go? You could kind of say his one answer is that your neighbor includes the person that you want to exclude, like a Samaritan who is potentially better than you think he is. The second answer, separately, is that, if you're the true child of the kingdom, you're not just going to love your neighbor, but you're going to love your enemy too. In other words, the enemy meaning explicitly that person who's not your neighbor, but that person who is the lexical opposite of your neighbor. In that sense, the command to love your enemy rather than just loving your neighbor is a little bit like the command to forgive not just 7 times but 70 times 7. The idea seems to be do the virtuous thing, but not just as would be morally expected, but do it also to the nth degree. Do it in those specific situations that would seem to be the exception. If you're wondering what the exception is, do it in the exception. Seems to be kind of the point he's trying to make. And it's also worth mentioning that historically speaking, unless I'm mistaken, I had to look into this a little more, but it seems like early on, there actually was more of a formally enemy type relationship between the Samaritans and Jews. It seems like you see a little bit of that in the book of Nehemiah. And if that's the case, that would also draw a little more of a connection between these 2 points. But I need to look more into that to get a better idea of the ins and outs of what that actually looks like. But anyway, so we could suggest then that in terms of the meaning of the word, your neighbor it's kind of like your fellow. Your neighbor is the person who is not your enemy. We have a different kind of obligation to our neighbor than we do to our enemy. Now, Christianity steps beyond ordinary morality by suggesting we love our enemies as well. But the suggestion to support our neighbor is really just the ordinary morality that almost all cultures have adhered to for most of history, simply because that's the only way a society can cohere. Now, the command to love your neighbor, specifically, to love your neighbor, is certainly not something you see universally. But the idea of supporting your neighbor, cooperating with your neighbor, that kind of thing, we could say that that part is kind of necessary. Necessary in the sense that if you don't do it, then your community's pretty quickly just going to fall apart and dissolve into chaos. Anyway, all right, so that's the first one there. Now let's think about the second one. The second word here, after Philadelphia, we got philoxenia, which means hospitality. And the reason it stands